We are looking at subject to contract and conditional contracts. Both of these are very important contracts when we are looking at sale and purchase of land, especially in this course of land dealings. We need to first look at the definition of subject to contract. In the UK, an agreement can be agreed to by the parties. But assuming an agreement as such is made subject to contract, then are we correct to assume that an enforceable contract will not be created until a formal contract is signed? What is the implication of the term subject to contract? Are the parties still in the state of negotiation? Have the terms been agreed upon? Are there still salient matters to be discussed? These are some of the questions that we will be looking at. In Malaysia, however, if an oral agreement is agreed upon, as we all know under Section 10 of the Contracts Act, any agreement is a contract. The question then for us to ask will be, are the parties still in the process of negotiation, or have they reached a stage where at least a conditional contract has been concluded? Or do they actually mean that a concluded contract stage has been achieved? Now, the reason it's important is because once a contract has been created, parties' obligations come into play. If there is no contract, then the parties do not have any obligations. Please keep that in mind. So, subject to contract ataupun yang boleh dikatakan tertakluk kepada kontrak, artinya adalah adakah suatu kontrak telah diwujudkan ataupun pihak-pihak masih menunggu untuk suatu kontrak formal diwujudkan. In the case of Tata Cermat, Sendirian Berhad and Perbandaran Kemajuan Negeri Kedah, there was a concluded contract. That's what the court held, despite the want of a duly executed formal agreement. There was an offer, there was acceptance, there was consideration, certainty of the parties, certainty of price, and certainty of subject matter, the property. Coupled with all of that, unequivocal acts of part performance by the plaintiff in the payment of the deposit, coupled with the 5,000 meant for squatters, was also there. Charles Granier then brings us to another aspect. The correspondence between the parties was sufficient to constitute a binding contract. The phrase subject to the sale and purchase agreement did not point to an intention that no contract was to come into existence until a formal sale and purchase agreement had been prepared and executed. So, looking at two English cases, Rossiter and Miller, and G. Percy Trentham and Architel Luxfer, we can come to the conclusion is the courts may say there is a concluded contract, even where the parties contemplated the execution of a more formal document. To borrow the words of Lord Denning, and you can see a spade is a spade as long as it looks like a spade and it performs the functions of a spade. It is a spade. You can't call it by any other name. Similarly, a 5-pronged instrument is a fork. You can't call that a spade because it has the features and the characteristics of a fork. So this is what we need to keep in mind as we look at concluded contracts or not. So we have cases for discussion here. We have the case of Air Hitam Tin Dredging Malaysia and YC Chin Enterprises. And this particular case demands a lot of attention because a number of aspects are discussed in that case. Jong Ah Hui and Ban Chun and Company, Abdul Rahim and Ramakrishnan, Kandasamy and Lau Kayit and Muhammad Isa, Kamma Theatre, New Selangor Plantations, Farm, Lim Chia Min, and Malayan Flour Mills. I shall be assigning these cases to you all, and you will then be presenting it at a lecture, an hour that we will decide soon enough. Thank you. Moving on to the second contract, it is the conditional contract. Now, many times students make the mistake of writing about conditional contract when they're actually supposed to write about subject to contract. Now, do bear in mind, I will be very specific in my questions. I will tell you clearly that you're supposed to discuss subject to contract in this question. And if you still insist on conditional contract, then you need to go and look for help. Not from me, but maybe from upstairs. Okay, let's look at conditional contract. Conditional contract, the provisions that are important are sections 32 to 37 of the Contracts Act 1950. Parties to a contract may sometimes enter into contracts with conditions attached. There are two types of conditions. These are conditions precedent and conditions subsequent. Now, conditions precedent are important, very significant, because if those conditions are not fulfilled, then the contract does not come into existence. There is no contract. So parties are not bound to comply with any of the terms in the so-called agreement. Conditions subsequent, on the other hand, means the contract has already come into existence. A contract, a valid and enforceable contract, has been created. Therefore, the terms in the contract you need to now go through with a fine-tooth comb and see whether or not there are conditions to be fulfilled. For example, are there squatters on the land? Do you need to remove the squatters before you can start work if you're a housing developer? Whose duty is it to remove the squatters? Yours or the seller? Make sure. Next aspect, which is very important, is there a condition on title or a restriction which says this land is for agricultural purpose only? If so, then if you want to have buildings put on the land, you will have to change the use of land to buildings. So please look at that as well. How long do you have to get the condition fulfilled? So in this type of a contract, at the risk of repetition, remember a valid contract has already come into existence. But in the former condition precedent, there is no contract until the condition is fulfilled. There are again cases for discussion: Aberfoyle Plantations and Kor Bien Ching, Lu Chu Teng, and another in Chok Swee Lee, Dynamic Mold, East Acres Development, and the case of Pulau Pinang Clinic, Sendirian, Berhad, and Shui Kat and Po. Now, who's going to present these cases? Not me, all of you. I shall allocate the cases accordingly, and you will prepare and present in a Zoom session for a lecture that I will set. For further reading, I've also given you some other cases. These are the Australian and New Zealand cases, and I think they're also important, especially try to look at the case of Perry and Kulangata Investments, K. Umar Kandaraja and L. Magnus, Chok Swee, Pembinaan Sepadu, and Timur Permai Holdings Sendirian Berhad. I may not be asking you all to present, except that I may ask someone to present the first two cases, Perry and Kolangata Investments and Chintai and Shou Xiao. All these will be in our lectures when we start having our lectures again.